The snow wasn't just falling, it was erasing the world. Martha Jane felt it bury the road, then her boots, then her will to live. Each step was a plunge into a white grave she was digging for herself. The town was gone behind her, swallowed by the storm. Their voices weren't. Useless, too slow, too much. The words were colder than the wind biting at her cheeks. A widow at 28, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a shame so heavy it bent her spine. She had believed them. That was the cruelest part. She had looked in the mirror and seen the worthless woman they all whispered about. Now the forest ahead waited like a dark mouth, ready to swallow her whole. Her own voice was a stranger when it came out, a thin crackle in the roaring silence. "I ain't worth much." She whispered it to the trees, to the snow, to the God who had clearly forgotten her name. She said it like a prayer, a final, bitter prayer, and then her knees gave out. Dusk was settling, turning the white snow to a bruised purple. She sank into a drift, the cold seeping in, a welcome numbness. This was it. This was surrender. She closed her eyes, ready for the silence to take her. But the silence was broken. A sound. A crunching in the snow. Not an animal. It was deliberate. Heavy. A shadow fell over her, big as a pine tree. A man's voice, rough as scraped bark, cut through the fog in her mind. "Ma'am?" he said. A pause. Snow was brushed from her sleeve. "You'll freeze out here." Before she could protest, strong arms were lifting her. She was weightless, a child being carried from a nightmare. She tried to fight, a weak murmur escaping her lips. "Don't trouble yourself, sir. I ain't worth much." The words were automatic, the anthem of her despair. The man didn't answer. He just held her tighter and turned, walking back into the storm like it was no more than a gentle rain. His grip was steady, his step sure. He was walking her away from the death she had chosen. But where was he taking her? And more importantly, why? His cabin was carved into the hillside, a block of wood and stone against the fury of the winter. Smoke curled from its chimney, a gray finger pointing at the dark sky. The door groaned open, and warmth rushed out to meet them, the smell of fire and pine and something else. Safety. He carried her inside and set her down gently by the hearth, the stone warm against her back. He knelt and stirred the fire, the orange light catching in his thick, white-streaked beard and the deep lines around his eyes. He was a man made of mountains, a creature of this harsh land. The heat on her skin was 1,000 tiny needles, reminding her body it was still alive, even if her spirit had already given up. Shame, hot and familiar, rose in her throat. To be found like this, a half-frozen stray, a burden on a stranger. "I'll be gone come morning," she whispered, the words sharp with a bitterness she aimed at herself. He didn't look at her. He simply hung an iron kettle over the flames, the clank of metal filling the small room. He moved with a purpose that left no room for argument. He set a bowl and spoon on the rough-hewn table. Not for her, not yet. He was just preparing. When the stew was hot, he ladled a portion into the bowl, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud of venison and herbs. He placed it on the table and then walked away, picking up a cracked rifle stock and a whittling knife. He sat at his workbench, back partially to her, and began to work. He was leaving her to choose. The scent of the stew was torture. It called to the empty, aching pit in her stomach, but the voices from the town screamed louder. "Greedy! Lazy! You don't deserve it." She sat frozen, her body trembling, caught between starvation and shame. The only sounds were the scrape of his knife against the wood and the crackle of the fire. It felt like an eternity. Finally, her hand, shaking so badly she could barely control it, reached for the spoon. The first mouthful was a shock. It was rebellion. It was a declaration that she was still here. She ate quickly, silently, terrified he would turn and watch her, see the desperate animal she had become. But when she risked a glance, he was still focused on his work, granting her the dignity of not being seen in her moment of weakness. Night fell hard. The storm raged outside, rattling the shutters like an angry beast. Jedediah, as she would later learn his name was, set down his tools. He poured hot tea into a tin cup and placed it on the floor beside her. He did it without a word, without even a look. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it felt monumental. She studied him then, really looked at him. The sheer breadth of his shoulders, the weathered map of his face, the way he moved with a calm, deliberate grace despite a slight limp. This was a man who knew solitude, who had likely weathered 100 storms, both inside and out. So why had he bothered with her? Why carry this piece of human wreckage back to his sanctuary? The memory of the townspeople sneered at her from the shadows of the cabin, the women's cruel smirks, the men's loud, braying laughter at the saloon. They had picked her apart piece by piece until nothing was left. She had married a man who left her with nothing but his debts and a tarnished name. They called her a fool for it, lazy for grieving, greedy for accepting charity. They had built a prison of shame around her, and she had willingly locked the door herself. Now, even in this warm, safe place, the prison walls felt as real as the log cabins. She had to get out. She stood up, her shawl wrapped around her like armor. The storm hadn't died down much. The world outside was a churning void of white. Jedediah saw her rise. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the door, lifted the heavy latch, and pulled it open. The wind screamed into the cabin, a blast of icy fury that stole her breath and plastered her dress to her legs. It was the same cold that had nearly claimed her just hours ago. She stood on the threshold, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her was the fire, the smell of stew, the quiet presence of the man who had saved her. In front of her was the death she had sought. Shame had pushed her out into the storm. But as the wind clawed at her face, she realized something else. Something stronger was holding her back. Slowly, she pushed the heavy door shut, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing the turning of a lock in her own soul. She sagged against the wood, defeated but, for the first time, not entirely hopeless. Jedediah gave no sign of triumph. He just nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin, and went back to the hearth. He had let her make the choice. And in that moment, she understood that her life, for better or worse, was still her own to decide. But a new question began to form in her mind, one that was even more unsettling than the storm outside. This man had saved her, fed her, and now kept her here with his silence. He was no simple Samaritan. He had a reason. And she had a terrifying feeling it had something to do with the very past she had been trying to escape. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Martha Jane found herself moving, acting, doing. She swept the floor, mended a tear in her shawl with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box, and stoked the fire when it burned low. He never asked her to do anything. She just did it. And he, in turn, accepted her small contributions with a quiet nod. When he came inside, stamping snow from his boots, she would move them closer to the fire to dry. When he skinned a rabbit for their meal, she would have the pot ready. It was a language without words, a partnership forged in the heart of the blizzard. For the first time in years, she felt not like a burden, but simply present. But the outside world, and the town that had cast her out, was never far from her mind. One morning, Jedediah saddled his horse, a big, sturdy beast as stoic as its owner. "Town," he said, the single word hanging in the air. "For flour." She watched him go, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. What would they say to him? What lies would they tell about the woman he was sheltering? He returned hours later, his beard caked in ice, his face grim. He wasn't carrying one sack of flour, he was carrying 2, and a large bag of salted pork and coffee and sugar, enough for a month, enough for 2 people. "Snow's heavy this year," he said, his voice flat, offering an explanation she hadn't asked for. Better to be stocked up. But she saw the truth in the set of his jaw. He hadn't just bought supplies. He had made a statement. He was planning for her to be here. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. To be included in someone's future, even for a short while, was a hope so dangerous it made her dizzy. That evening, as she was folding her shawl by the firelight, she felt his eyes on her. It wasn't the look of a man sizing up a woman. It was something else, something deeper. An unnerving stillness, as if he were looking right through her skin and into the battered core of her. She turned away, her cheeks burning. The old words, the poison she had swallowed for so long, slipped out before she could stop them. I ain't worth much. She hated herself for saying it, for showing him that weakness. She expected his usual silence, the silence that allowed her to wallow in her own misery. But this time, he spoke. His voice was low and steady, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "Ma'am," he said, and she flinched, waiting for the pity. "You've yet to see what I see." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. What did he see? What could he possibly see in this broken woman that she couldn't see in herself? Fear warred with a desperate curiosity. She wanted to ask, to demand he explain, but the words wouldn't come. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. Outside, the wind began to howl again, the storm gathering its strength for another assault. The little cabin was an island of warmth in a sea of frozen death, and in the space between them hung a question, a promise, a possibility so immense it scared her more than the blizzard. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a mystery he was intent on solving. And she was beginning to realize that the key to that mystery might destroy everything she thought she knew about her own life. The next day, he handed her an axe. It was smaller than his, the handle worn smooth with use. "The woodpile's low," he said, not as a command, but as a simple statement of fact. Her hands, soft from years of mending and kitchen work, felt clumsy and weak around the handle. She followed him outside, the cold air a slap in the face. He showed her how to brace the log, how to read the grain, where to strike. His instruction was patient, methodical. He didn't praise her when she finally split a log cleanly, nor did he criticize her when the axe glanced off harmlessly. He just watched, his expression unreadable. She worked until her arms screamed and her back ached, sweat freezing on her forehead. But with each log that split, a tiny, unfamiliar feeling sparked to life inside her. It wasn't pride, it was power. The power to create warmth, to fight back against the cold. She was not just a mouth to feed, she was a pair of hands that could work. That night, the wolves came. Their howls sliced through the darkness, a chorus of hunger and death circling the cabin. Martha's blood ran cold. She remembered the stories, the whispers in town of livestock torn to pieces, of a trapper who went out and never came back. She was helpless, a liability, a dead weight in a world that demanded strength. Jedediah moved without panic. He took his rifle down from the wall, his movements economical and sure. He checked the powder, his face a mask of concentration. Then he looked at her. His eyes weren't filled with fear or annoyance. They were filled with an expectation that terrified her. "Hold the lantern," he said, his voice calm and low. He pressed the heavy glass and metal lamp into her trembling hands. She wanted to say no, to shrink back into the corner by the fire. But his gaze held her, steady and certain. It was as if he had already seen her do this, as if he knew she wouldn't drop it. He unlatched the door and pulled it open just a crack. The wind howled, and with it came the snarling of the pack. She stepped forward, her heart a frantic drum, and held the lantern high. Its yellow beam cut a shaky circle in the swirling snow. At the edge of the light, she saw them. gleaming eyes like hot coals in the darkness, low, slinking shapes darting in and out of view. A low growl rumbled from the pack leader, its teeth bared. Her arm ached from the weight of the lantern, her knuckles white. The flame flickered, threatening to go out. But she held on. She focused on the light, on keeping it steady, on being the rock he needed her to be. The rifle cracked, the sound a physical shockwave that rolled across the valley. One of the shapes yelped and fell. The others scattered, melting back into the darkness like ghosts. Jedediah closed the door, the silence in the cabin suddenly deafening. He leaned the rifle against the wall and turned to her. He took the lantern from her numb fingers and set it on the table. He looked at her hands, still clenched as if holding the lamp. Then he met her eyes. "Strong hands," he said. Just 2 words, but they landed in her soul like seeds falling on fertile ground. They were strong. They had held the light. They hadn't failed. But the look in his eye told her something more. He wasn't just talking about the lantern. He was talking about something else entirely. Something he knew about her that she was only just beginning to discover. He was testing her. But for what? The trips to town became a source of constant dread. Every time Jedediah rode out, Martha imagined the whispers, the sneers. She knew the people of this valley. She knew their small, cruel hearts. One afternoon, consumed by a morbid curiosity, she followed him. She wrapped her shawl tight, keeping her head down, trailing him at a distance like a nervous ghost. The town felt alien, hostile. Eyes followed her from behind shuttered windows. She heard a door close too quickly as she passed. They were watching her, judging her. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smell of pipe smoke and gossip. A group of men were gathered around the pot-bellied stove, their laughter stopping the moment she stepped inside. Jedediah was at the counter, negotiating for a bag of salt. A man named Silas Croft, a loud-mouthed bully whose farm bordered her old lost property, let out a sneer. "Well, look what the storm dragged in. Boone, you feeding 2 mouths now? From the looks of her, one of them's eating more than her share." The other men chuckled, a low, nasty sound. Shame washed over Martha, hot and sickening. She wanted to sink through the floorboards. She wanted to die. Jedediah didn't even turn around at first. He calmly finished his transaction, placing the coins on the counter. Then, he straightened up to his full, formidable height and slowly turned to face Silas. His voice wasn't loud. It was colder than the winter wind. "You want to say that again, Silas?" It wasn't a question. It was a threat. Silas, who was a big man himself, suddenly seemed to shrink. He shuffled his feet, cleared his throat. "Just a joke, Boone. No harm meant." "Some jokes have a price," Jedediah said, his eyes like chips of granite. He held Silas's gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment, the silence stretching until it was humming with tension. Finally, Silas looked away, muttering something under his breath. Jedediah picked up his sack of salt, gave a curt nod to the store owner, and walked out. Martha scurried after him, her face burning, tears of humiliation stinging her eyes. But underneath the shame, something new was stirring. A flicker of warmth. He hadn't just defended her. He had claimed her, in a way. He had drawn a line in the snow and dared anyone to cross it. He had stood between her and the world. That night, she couldn't sleep. The scene in the store played over and over in her mind. His quiet anger. The fear in Silas Croft's eyes. She was bringing trouble to his door. His reputation, his solitary peace, was being threatened because of her. The old refrain started up in her head. "I ain't worth it. I'm ruining his name." She had to leave, for his sake. She quietly gathered her meager belongings, her mended shawl, the needle and thread, a small wooden bird her father had carved for her years ago. It was all she had left of her old life. She crept toward the door, her hand reaching for the latch. Before her fingers could touch the cold iron, a floorboard creaked behind her. She froze. Jedediah was standing there, a silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He wasn't angry. He wasn't disappointed. His face was calm, as if he'd been expecting this. He walked toward her, his limp more pronounced in the quiet of the night. He didn't say a word. He simply took the small bundle from her hands and set it on the table. Then he took her hands in his. They were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He looked down at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that looked like pain. "I know what you're thinking," he rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "That you're trouble. That I'd be better off without you." He paused, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "My wife, Sarah, she used to say the same thing." Martha's breath caught in her throat. His wife? He had never mentioned a wife. "She got sick," he continued, his eyes distant, looking at a memory only he could see. "The town. They have long memories and short charity. They said she was cursed. They wouldn't help. I brought her up here, to this cabin, to get her away from their poison, to try and heal her." He looked back at Martha, his eyes boring into hers. "I failed. I wasn't strong enough. I let their words get inside my head. I let the winter win." His voice broke on the last word. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. This cabin wasn't a sanctuary. It was a tomb, filled with his guilt and regret. And then he said the words that shattered her world. "Her maiden name was Miller, Sarah Miller. She was your husband's older sister." Martha swayed, her mind reeling. Her husband, James, had an older sister? He had told her his entire family was gone, lost to fever years ago. It was a lie. Another lie in a life that was quickly unraveling. This wasn't a random rescue. This wasn't charity. This was penance. Jedediah Boone hadn't saved a stranger from the snow. He had saved his sister-in-law. "James told me. He told me you all died," she stammered, the words tasting like ash. Jedediah's face hardened. "James told a lot of folks a lot of things. Most of them weren't true." He let go of her hands and walked to a small locked chest in the corner of the room. He knelt and opened it, pulling out a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "Sarah wrote to him. Begged him for money for a doctor from the city. He never answered. He was too busy spending the money he'd borrowed from half the folks in town, the money he promised to invest for him." He stood up and faced her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "That's why they hate you, Martha. It's not because you're a widow, it's because you're his widow. Every time they look at you, they see the money he stole from them." The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The whispers, the sneers, the cold shoulders, it all made a horrible kind of sense now. She wasn't just a burden. She was a symbol of their loss and his betrayal. She was the living reminder of the man who had ruined them. And Jedediah. He had been living with this knowledge all along, watching her, testing her, waiting. But waiting for what? "Why?" she whispered, the only word she could force out. "Why save me?" He looked at her, and the anger in his eyes softened into a profound sadness. "Because I made a promise to my Sarah on her deathbed, that I wouldn't let the winter win again. And because when I look at you, I don't see James's wife." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I see her. I see the same fire, the same strength she had before the world tried to snuff it out. And I won't let that happen. Not again." He gently took her mittens, which she had dropped on the floor, and placed them back in her hands. "You are not him. You are not their lost money. And you ain't trouble." He looked her straight in the eye, and the world seemed to stop. "You're a chance for me to get it right this time. You're worth everything." The revelation changed everything. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a place of ghosts and unspoken history. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was filled with the questions Martha was too afraid to ask. Jedediah treated her no differently, but she saw everything through a new lens. His quiet patience was no longer just kindness. It was a debt he was paying to a dead woman. The extra sack of flour wasn't an investment in her future. It was an obligation. She had not been rescued. She had been claimed. A piece of his past he was determined to fix. She found herself studying him, searching for glimpses of the man he was, before grief had carved him out of stone. Sometimes, when a particular slant of light hit the cabin, or when a bird sang outside the window, she would see a flicker of something in his eyes, a memory of a life before this one. He started talking more, not about his wife, but about the mountain. He taught her the names of the trees, how to read the tracks of a deer in the snow, which berries were safe to eat and which were poison. He was teaching her to survive. But it felt more like he was preparing her for a battle. One afternoon, he took her to a small, sheltered grove of aspen trees behind the cabin. There, under a simple mound of stones, was a wooden cross. Sarah Boone, beloved wife. He stood before the grave for a long time, his hat in his hands, the wind whipping his graying hair. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sorrow coming off him was a palpable thing, a cold aura in the winter air. Martha stood beside him, a silent partner in his grief. She was connected to this woman by a lie, a stranger who wore the face of a family she never knew she had. She felt a profound sense of trespass, but also a strange kinship. They were both women betrayed by the same man. As they walked back to the cabin, Jedediah finally spoke, his voice hoarse. James was always chasing easy money. He had a charm about him, could talk a bird right out of the sky. He convinced Silas Croft and half the valley to invest in some new railroad scheme, promised to double their money in a year. He kicked at a drift of snow, his anger a sudden, sharp thing. There was no scheme. He just took the money and ran. Left me to clean up his mess, left you to face their hate. Now she understood the particular venom in Silas Croft's eyes. It wasn't just casual cruelty. It was personal. She was the wife of the man who had likely ruined him. The knowledge settled in her bones, cold and heavy. She had spent a year believing she was worthless because she was a widow. The truth was so much worse. She was worthless because she was a thief's wife. "You should have told me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You let me believe I was nothing." He stopped and turned to her, his face etched with regret. "I know, but I saw how brittle you were, how much you believed their lies. I was afraid the truth would break you for good. I had to show you your own strength first, the woman who could hold the lantern against the wolves, the woman who could split wood in a storm. I needed you to see her before you could face him." He looked her in the eye. "Are you ready to face him now?" Before she could answer, a new sound cut through the air. Not the howl of a wolf or the cry of the wind. It was a shout. A human voice, faint but desperate, carried on the wind. Then another. They looked at each other, the same alarm in their eyes. The blizzard, which had been a constant low growl for days, had suddenly escalated into a full-blown roar. "Someone's caught out in it," Jedediah said, already moving toward the cabin. "A big one. It's the White Death." Inside, he worked with grim efficiency, grabbing ropes, blankets, and 2 lanterns. He handed one to her. "Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "No," she said, the word coming out sharp and clear, surprising them both. She pulled on her mittens, her movements sure and steady. "You taught me how to read the snow. You taught me how to be strong." She looked at the pain in his eyes, the guilt he carried for the wife he couldn't save. "You said you wouldn't let the winter win again. Neither will I. I'm coming with you." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, He wasn't seeing his dead wife's ghost. He was seeing Martha Jane. He saw the fire he had banked, now burning bright and hot. He gave a single sharp nod. They tied a rope between them, a lifeline in the churning chaos, and stepped out into the teeth of the storm together. This wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a reckoning. And Martha knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the snow, that the people they were going to save were the very same people who had left her to die. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear them apart. Snow blinded them, stinging their faces like 1,000 icy needles. The world was a roaring white chaos, and the rope connecting them was the only thing that felt real. Jedediah led, leaning into the gale, his every step a battle. Martha followed, her lantern held high, its small, brave light pushing back against the suffocating darkness. It was a tiny beacon in an ocean of white fury. They followed the faint cries, stumbling through drifts that were waist-deep, their lungs burning with the effort of breathing the frozen air. They found the wagon first. It was half buried in a snowdrift, one of its wheels broken, the horses gone. Huddled inside were several figures, barely moving, their faces pale and frostbitten. Jedediah hauled them out, his strength seeming superhuman. As Martha wrapped a blanket around a shivering woman, she looked into her face and her heart stopped. It was Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, a woman who had often crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Next to her, his face blue with cold, was her husband, the man who had once called Martha a charity case loud enough for the whole store to hear. They looked at her now, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. There was no recognition, no gratitude, just the dull shock of near death. Martha felt a bitter taste in her mouth, but she pushed it down. They were just people, cold and dying people. She worked alongside Jedediah, her hands sure and steady, her voice calm as she urged them to their feet. They pressed on, finding more. A small group that had tried to make a run for it now collapsed in the snow. Among them, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, was Silas Croft. His face, usually red with arrogance and drink, was a waxy, terrifying gray. When he saw Martha, his eyes widened. He tried to speak, but his lips were too frozen. It was Martha who knelt beside him, who checked his leg, who helped Jedediah fashion a crude splint from a broken branch and strips of her own shawl. She tore the fabric without a second thought, the same shawl that had been her only comfort, her shield against the world's cruelty. Now she was using it to save the man who had hated her most. The journey back was a living nightmare. They were a ragged chain of survivors, lashed together by ropes, stumbling through the blizzard. Jedediah was at the front, a human snowplow, while Martha was in the middle, holding the lantern, her light a beacon for the desperate group. She encouraged them, shouted at them when they wanted to give up, physically held them up when they fell. She felt a strength she never knew she possessed, a fire in her belly that burned hotter than any blizzard. This wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about their cruelty or her shame. It was about life against death. It was about holding the light in the darkest of storms. When they finally staggered back to the cabin, they were more dead than alive. Martha and Jedediah worked tirelessly, stripping off frozen clothes, rubbing life back into numb limbs, forcing hot broth between chattering teeth. The small cabin was crowded with the ghosts of her past, the faces of her tormentors. But now they were just cold, frightened people, their arrogance stripped away by the storm. They looked at her with new eyes. They saw the woman who had torn her own shawl to splint a broken leg. They saw the woman who had carried their children when they were too weak to walk. They saw the woman who had held the light that guided them home. Days later, when the storm had finally broken and the survivors were strong enough to travel, a silence fell over the cabin. No one knew what to say. It was Silas Croft who finally broke it. He was propped up by the fire, his splinted leg resting on a stool. He looked at Martha, his eyes clear for the first time she could remember. We were wrong about you, Martha Jane, he stammered, the words clumsy and difficult. We let our anger at your husband poison us. He looked over at Jedediah. He told us about the money, about what James did. Then he looked back at Martha, and she saw real gut-wrenching shame in his eyes. We left you to die, and you saved us. There ain't no way to repay that. A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. Mrs. Gable was openly weeping. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. It was the truth, finally brought out into the light. Jedediah stood by the door, watching, his face unreadable. He had given them the facts, but he had let them come to their own conclusions. He had let Martha's actions speak for themselves, and they had spoken louder than any gossip, any lie. As the townsfolk prepared to leave, Silas Croft pushed himself up on his crutch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He held it out to Martha. "It ain't much," he said, his voice thick. "It's what I have left, a down payment, on what he owed, on what we owe you." Martha looked at the pouch, then at the faces of the people around her. She saw their shame, their regret, their dawning respect. She had walked out into the snow to die because she believed she wasn't worth anything. Now, the very people who had convinced her of that were offering her payment for her life. She looked at Jedediah, and he gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was her choice. Her victory. She gently pushed Silas's hand away. "Keep it," she said, her voice clear and strong, a voice they had never heard before. "You'll need it to rebuild. We all will." She wasn't the wife of a thief anymore. She wasn't a burden or a charity case. She was the woman who held the lantern. The fire crackled in the hearth, the cabin once again quiet and peaceful. The townsfolk were gone, leaving behind a silence that was full not of ghosts, but of possibilities. Jedediah sat across from her, oiling his rifle, the motions familiar and comforting. The air between them was different now. The debts had been paid, the truths revealed. She looked at her hands, no longer soft and useless, but chapped and strong. They had built fires, held lanterns, saved lives. She looked up and met his gaze, and this time, she didn't look away. "You were wrong about something," she said softly. His hands stilled, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. A slow smile spread across her face, the first true, unburdened smile she had felt in years. "You said I was worth everything to you," she said, her voice trembling just a little, not with fear, but with a powerful, soaring joy. "The truth is, I'm worth everything to me." The corners of his mouth lifted in a smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes, washing away the years of grief. He set aside the rifle and leaned forward, the firelight dancing between them. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble of pride. "I've known it all along." Outside, the world was blanketed in a pristine, silent layer of snow. It wasn't an ending. It was a clean slate. A new beginning, earned not with money or forgiveness, but with the simple, unwavering strength of a woman who had walked into the darkness and chosen to carry her own light. And in the glow of that fire, Martha Jane finally understood. Your worth is not something that other people can give you, and it's not something they can take away. It's the light you choose to hold, especially when the world goes dark. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of a second chance, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of survival and redemption. We'll see you in the next one.